All right, everyone, I want to thank you for joining us today. My name is Vargas, and I am a student at the School of Kroc and a student for a Master's in Peace and Justice. I'm a second-year student. I'm also Vice President of the Kroc Graduate Student Association. Before we get started, I just want to acknowledge what is happening and has been going on in Palestine as of lately. For the past month, there has been a serious upscale of violence within the West Bank by the occupation forces against Palestinians. The UN Humanitarian Coordinator for the occupied Palestinian territories has stated that this is the deadliest year for Palestinians since 2006. This year, about 130 Palestinians have been killed so far, with at least 26 this month alone. And within that 26, 8 of them have been children. Additionally, for the past 2 weeks, the city of Nablus has been under siege and blockade by the occupation forces for the past 2 weeks. With that being said, this conversation is something that is ongoing and evolving as things change within Palestine. And it's important that spaces like this are respectful and inclusive for all people who may be affected in many different ways of what's happening in Palestine now. So with that being said, I'm very happy to introduce once again our presenter for this event. Zooming all the way from Palestine, we have Lubna from Badil. She is the advocacy manager at Badil Resource Center for Palestinian Residency and Refugee Rights. As a Palestinian human rights defender and activist, Lubna has a bachelor's degree in molecular biology and a master's of business administration from the University of Michigan. She has been working with Badil since 2012 and is responsible for overseeing donor relations, fund development, research, and advocacy. Thank you for joining us once again, Lubna, especially considering the time difference and that you're coming all the way from Palestine.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you for having me, and thank you for putting together these talks. I'm going to just pull up a slideshow. Oh, can you go ahead and enable the screen sharing, Eric?
Yes, sorry about that.
No problem. Okay.
Okay, is it enabled now?
Yes, yes, it is.
Awesome.
Okay, I am going to do a very quick review of the things that we covered in the last webinar. And then if need be, if there are any, we'll hold off questions until the end, if that's okay with everyone, but go ahead and feel free to put things into the chat or hang on to your questions in some way, shape, or form until I guess I'm done with the presentation. But as I said, if there's anything that I've covered either from the last time we were together and this time, please feel free to ask. Badil Resource Center for Palestinian Residency and Refugee Rights is a Palestinian human rights organization that was established in 1998 with the specific purpose of promoting and defending the rights of the Palestinian people, and in particular, Palestinian refugees and internally displaced persons. As a human rights organization, Badil analyzes and uses various frameworks of international law to describe and diagnose the situation in Palestine. And one of the ways and the descriptive words that we use to describe the situation in Palestine is the ongoing Nakba. And this is because we firmly believe that the Nakba is not something that is relegated to history, but rather it's an ongoing situation, because the Israeli regime, and prior to it, the Zionist movement, is specifically seeking to control the maximum amount of land in Palestine with the minimum number of Palestinians on that land. So we have seen in our history and continue to see today waves of displacement. And these waves of displacement do not stop. They are ongoing. and they are coupled with the denial of return. So for example, from 1917 to about 1947, during the occupation by the British and the formation of the British Mandate, approximately 150,000 Palestinians found themselves displaced, usually by policies and practices implemented by the British themselves to denationalize Palestinians. Then in 1948, during the historic Nakba, approximately 750,000 Palestinians were displaced and transferred outside the area that came to be called Israel, while another 40 to 60,000 were displaced inside the area that came to be called Israel. Then in 1967, when Israel occupied the rest of Palestine, another 500,000 Palestinians were displaced, some of them for a second time because they were displaced initially during the Nakba of 1948. Today, we still continue to see Israel applying policies and practices that serve to displace Palestinians. And we'll talk about the different ways that they do so, both historically and contemporarily in the present day. But as I said, the goal of these policies and practices, the goal of the Israeli regime is to control the maximum amount of land in Palestine with the minimum number of Palestinians. So not only do they have to displace Palestinians to forcibly remove them from their places of origin and habitual residence, but they also have to keep them away. Hence the coupling of the two practices, the ongoing displacement and transfer and the ongoing denial of return. Both of those things, of course, are considered violations of international law. Forced displacement and transfer is considered an international crime, as well as the denial of return. Now, when we talk about displacement and transfer, we talk about two different types of people or two different categories of forcibly displaced persons. One is a refugee and the other is an IDP, or an internally displaced person. Now, the difference between the two is logistic or geographical. Refugees are forcibly displaced and they are forced to cross an internationally recognized border. So Palestinians who are displaced, for example, during the Nakba and left what came to be called Israel and entered into the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, or the surrounding countries, those individuals are referred to as refugees by international law. However, if you are displaced and you remain within the entity, you do not cross an internationally recognized border, you are called an IDP, or an internally displaced person. Now, regardless of where you were displaced to, the fact that you have been forcibly displaced requires that you have certain entitlements or rights owed to you according to international law. And we'll talk about those in a few minutes, but naturally, one of those rights is your right to return to the place from which you were displaced, to your place of origin and habitual residence. In order to understand forced displacement and transfer, we have to understand what international law recognizes as force. There has to be an element of unwillingness involved in the displacement or the transfer. So according to international law, there are also two types of force. One is the force that is derived from armed and violent conflict. So it's the actual violent physical removal or physical force is used to displace people from one area to another. We saw examples of this in 1948 and 1967, World War I, World War II, what's happening in Ukraine, what happened in the Gulf Wars between Iraq and Kuwait, and so on and so forth. And that's the traditional type of force, let's say, or it's the force that is most easy to see with the naked eye because there is actual physical violence involved, or there is physical forcible removal or displacement. The other type of force recognized by international law is what is called the coercive environment. The coercive environment is essentially the creation of a situation that is so unbearable that an individual or group really has no choice but to leave his or her place of origin or habitual residence. The coercive environment is fundamentally caused by the denial of your basic human rights. When we talk about basic human rights, we are talking about those rights that are essential for you to live in peace and dignity, free from fear, free from persecution or fear of persecution, the ability to access services, essential services like healthcare, education, the ability to have residency, the ability of freedom of movement, freedom of worship, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, all those essential or basic rights that are considered your basic or fundamental human rights according to international law, according to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So anytime one of those rights are violated, there is the creation of a coercive environment. And so no physical force is applied in this case, or in the case of a coercive environment, but rather a situation that forces you as an individual to go seek those essential rights somewhere else. And this is also recognized as force by international law. In order to deal with the Palestinian refugee crisis that was caused by the Nakba in 1948, the United Nations created two agencies, UNRWA and the UNCCP. UNRWA was created to fulfill one of the fundamental entitlements or rights owed to displaced persons according to international law. And that is the right to live in dignity during the period of your displacement. So essentially, UNRWA was told to provide for the basic needs and services to Palestinian refugees in particular. So UNRWA was out there in the beginning, providing things like food, blankets, tents, clothing, medicine, water, and so on and so forth. As the Palestinian refugee situation became more protracted, UNRWA became more of a service delivery type of organization. And the main services they attempt to provide are education and healthcare. So if you have the opportunity to visit an area that has a Palestinian refugee camp there, for example, in the West Bank, you will see in the refugee camps UNRWA schools and UNRWA health centers, and those are facilities that are run by UNRWA that attempt to provide these services, as I said, to Palestinian refugees. The UNCCP, which is the United Nations Conciliation Commission on Palestine, was actually created before UNRWA. It was created within UN Resolution 194. And if you're familiar with UN Resolution 194, it is one of the main resolutions. It is one of 5 UN resolutions that speaks specifically to the right of return of Palestinian refugees and internally displaced persons. Now, that resolution 194 and the other 4 resolutions that the UN created are actually reaffirmations of very fundamental legal frameworks that already existed in international law. And these, as I said, UN Resolution 194, as well as the other 4, speak to specifically the right of return of Palestinian refugees and IDPs. Unfortunately, however, the UNCCP, even though it exists today, it is basically a defunct organization, meaning that it has no operational activities. It is not active in a fundamental or on the ground way. And that is because it was basically made defunct by the actual committee that was created to kind of head the UNCCP. And so even though the UNCCP exists today, all it essentially does is send a report to the UN on the progress that has been made with regards to its mandate. And as I said, or I don't think I actually said it, but the UNCCP was created specifically to facilitate, coordinate, and implement the right of return of Palestinian refugees and IDPs. And so each year they submit a report to the UN that basically states that no progress has been made, because to this day, no progress has been made. Not a single Palestinian refugee or IDP has been allowed to exercise his or her right of return. Now, these two agencies were created, as I said, to fulfill fundamental entitlements or rights owed to displaced persons, but specifically the Palestinian refugee and IDP community. And because of the more or less failure of both of these agencies to fulfill their mandates, when we talk about Palestinian refugees and IDPs, we talk about them experiencing a protection gap. Because essentially the roles or the mandates of both UNRWA and the UNCCP are to provide what international law describes as international protection. And because they have failed to do so for various reasons that we could get into, perhaps towards the end, if anyone is interested in knowing a little bit more detail about how these organizations are not able to fulfill their mandates. We talk about Palestinian refugees experiencing, rather than having adequate international protection, they are experiencing a protection gap. Now, what does this mean for us? What does it mean for Palestinian refugees and IDPs? And what does it mean for the Palestinian population or the Palestinian people at large? It means that we are the largest and most protracted displaced population in the world. We are talking about 9.12 million people in total. This constitutes about 66% of the Palestinian population. So let's put these numbers into perspective. 66%, 2/3. That means that out of every 10 Palestinians you meet, 7 of them will have experienced displacement at least once in their lifetime, while significant numbers have experienced it more than once. Because essentially, because of the ongoing displacement and transfer, an individual can be a refugee and an IDP at the same time, depending on how many times he or she has been displaced and where they have been displaced to. Now, very quickly, I'm going to go put out a little promotion for one of our publications, and that's the Survey of Palestinian Refugees and IDPs. And this is a core research that Badil produces or attempts to produce every few years, where we provide, as much as possible, the most updated and accurate information on Palestinian refugees and IDPs. So of course, things like the statistical data and the numbers that you see before you are Badil numbers. Those are numbers that we were able to put together from various primary and secondary resources. Their socioeconomic situation, their distribution, and any other issues or developments that impacts their situation or their protection or their lack of protection. So I encourage you, we are actually publishing the 10th edition of the Survey of Palestinian Refugees and IDPs. It will be out this, probably early next month, because we're towards the end of October. Hopefully it'll be out early November, and you will find a more detailed description, as I said, of Palestinian refugees and IDPs within the survey. So how did we get here? How did we get to be the largest and most protracted displaced population in the world? As I said, we have to go back to those two basic policies, or those two basic approaches or methodologies that are used by Israel to continue to displace and transfer Palestinians, and also to continue to deny them return. We cannot escape, of course, the largest wave of displacements, the one that displaced a significant or the vast majority of Palestinians, and that is the Nakba of 1948. Nakba is the Palestinian word that means catastrophe, and it's used to describe that period from about 1947, the end of the British Mandate, to about 1950, where the largest numbers of Palestinians became refugees and internally displaced persons. And this wasn't something that happened as a consequence of something else. This was something that was intentional and specific, and it was carried out by the Zionist militias who were being directed by the Zionist leaders of that period. And the intent, of course, has always been to forcibly displace and transfer. And this is very clear, or was made very clear by various members of the Zionist militia, of the Zionist movement, because they were very actually upfront about it. And it was made, there's a lot of literature and a lot of statements made by the members of the Zionist movement, specifically detailing their intent for Palestine and for Palestinians. And the screen that you see now is one of those quotes, or one of the what I feel is one of the most accurate quotes that describes or embodies the mentality and the intent of the Zionist movement. And this particular one was said by Joseph Weitz, who was head of the land department of the Jewish National Fund. And Joseph, of course, was a member of the Zionist movement. And he said this in the 1930s. He said specifically that it must be clear that there is no room in the country for both people. There is no room here for compromise. There is no way but to transfer the Arabs from here to the neighboring countries. Not one village must be left, not one tribe. And so this intent, this purposeful intent of forcible transfer was embodied by the Zionist movement and then implemented by the Zionist militias. So they basically translated this intent or this purpose to ethnically cleanse Palestine into a series of military plans. And Plan Dalet was the first in the series of military plans that had the specific intention of ethnically cleansing Palestine of its indigenous population. Plan Dalet and the subsequent military plans, there were about a dozen or so, basically had three pillars or three main areas of operation, three activities. One of them was the depopulation and subsequent razing of villages. So the Zionist militias would enter a Palestinian village or community, force the inhabitants out, usually at gunpoint or using violent physical force, and then bulldozers would come in and raze the villages to the ground. Number two, they would come into an area, round up Palestinians, again using physical violent force, load them onto transportation vehicles and ship them out to other locations. This is particularly true, or one example of this happening is here in Al Ramla, where approximately 50,000 Palestinians were rounded up and shipped off to other locations. Now, these first two activities of Plan Dalet and the subsequent military plans carried out by the Zionist militias are clear examples of that first type of force, that traditional force, the violent physical removal of people from their places of origin and habitual residence. The third activity used by the Zionist militias in their various military plans is massacres. And massacres weren't used for the sake of the massacre itself, but the results of what the massacre brought about. So, for example, in April of 1948, Zionist militias entered the village of Deir Yassin. Deir Yassin is a very small village just outside of Jerusalem, and they massacred everyone they could get their hands on, men, women, children, the elderly, and so on and so forth. Approximately 100 Palestinians were massacred at the hands of the Zionist militias in Deir Yassin. The reason I mention Deir Yassin is, one, it's one of the most well-known massacres. It's also one of the most well-documented massacres that were committed at the hands of the Zionist militias. Within 24 hours, the ICRC, or the International Committee of the Red Cross, was in Deir Yassin and was able to document the massacres that occurred there. By no means is Deir Yassin the only massacre, nor is it the largest massacre that occurred at the hands of the Zionist militias. But put yourself in that position, or put yourself into 1948 and finding out about these various massacres that occurred. And when Palestinians found out about those massacres, they didn't stick around and wait for the Zionist militias to come to their villages and potentially do the same thing. So they fled in fear and terror. And so as the Zionist militias swept through Palestine, they often encountered empty villages, empty communities, empty towns, because Palestinians had fled for fear of persecution. This is a classic example of the creation of a coercive environment, where people feel that they had no choice but to leave in order to be able to enjoy their right to life and be able to enjoy their ability to live free from persecution, to seek out their essential or fundamental rights. And so, as a result of Plan Dalet and the subsequent military plans, the Zionist militias were significantly successful in ethnically cleansing Palestine of its indigenous population. But before I talk about that a little bit more, I do want to say that, again, the situation that happened during the Nakba, during that period from about 1947 to about 1949, 1950, was intentional on the part of the Zionist movement and continued as the Zionist militias transitioned into the Israeli military, because they were told, the Zionist militias, to attack on 3 sides, leaving the 4th side open in the direction they wanted Palestinians to go, which was also predetermined. Because if you see what Joseph said, the quote on the screen, he said, "There is no way but to transfer the Arabs from here to the neighboring countries." So there was also not only an intent to forcibly transfer Palestinians, but also to get them out of Palestine as much as possible. So Palestinians in the north, if you look at the illustration on the slide, in the north, Palestinians were pushed north into Lebanon and Syria. Along the coast here, they were pushed into what came to be called the West Bank and what was at that time Transjordan. And along the very coast, they were either pushed up into Lebanon or pushed down into what came to be called the Gaza Strip. And if we look at where the largest populations of Palestinian refugees reside, we will see that they reside in 5 main areas: the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. And incidentally, that's where UNRWA established its bases of operation, in those 5 locations. So as I said, as a result of Plan Dalet and the subsequent military plans, the Zionist movement, and then later the Israeli military, were successful in ethnically cleansing Palestine of its indigenous population. Approximately 750,000 Palestinians became refugees, while another 40 to 60,000 became internally displaced inside what came to be called Israel. So we have a situation in which they have made the land, made a land without people, even though they knew full well that Palestine was not a land without people. There were Palestinians there. So now what do they do? Now that they have ethnically cleansed the territory and they have established a new nation state, what do they need to do? As a new nation state, they began instituting or creating laws and legislation that would help them cement their control over Palestine and Palestinians. So the first batch of Israeli laws were the absentee property laws. And the absentee property laws basically state that even though I, Israel, have forcibly displaced you from your homes, and even though I, Israel, prevent you from returning to your homes, and we'll talk about prevention of return shortly, I, Israel, declare you to be absent. And as an absentee, you forfeit all rights to your property, and your property comes under the custodianship of Israel. And so what Israel did with the absentee property law is that they confiscated and funneled all the property belonging to Palestinian refugees in a custodianship that they controlled. But they didn't stop there. if you recall, not only were Palestinians made into refugees, but there were also internally displaced Palestinians, meaning that there were Palestinians inside what came to be called Israel, who were forcibly displaced, let's say, for example, from Haifa to Jaffa, or from Jaffa to the Nakba. They were not in their places of origin and habitual residence because of these forcible transfer policies and tactics that were used by the Zionist militias and the Israeli military. For them, they created a special clause, and this clause is called the present absentee. And even though it's an oxymoron and linguistically speaking, it's contradictory, because how can you be present and absent at the same time? But basically what the present absentee clause states is even though I know you are here, you are still present, I'm still going to declare you absent. And therefore you forfeit all rights to your property, and your property comes under the custodianship of Israel. And so with the absentee property laws and the present absentee clause, Israel essentially confiscated all the land belonging to Palestinian refugees and IDPs. And this essentially amounted to 78% of mandatory Palestine, 78%. And so Israel was founded upon that 78% of mandatory Palestine that still belongs to Palestinian refugees and IDPs, but is under the control of the newly created Israeli regime. So they were successful in ethnically cleansing the land. They were successful in illegally confiscating Palestinian refugee and IDP property. And now what they need to do is colonize the newly acquired territory with the desired population. And to facilitate this colonization, Israel created the law of return. The law of return was created in 1950 and basically states that any Jew from anywhere around the world can come and return or make aliyah to Palestine. Now, what is wrong with this law from a legal perspective or an international law perspective? Essentially, what the law of return or the Israeli law of return did is that it created a specific group that was identified by its religious denomination, namely being Jewish, and said that this group is superior because they are the only ones that are able to exercise the right of return. That means there is an inferior group, meaning those who are not Jewish, who are not able to exercise the right of return. And the non-Jewish population that is targeted by the Israeli law of return, of course, are Palestinians. So this is one of the ways in which Israel denies Palestinian return. Even more importantly, or as equally important, I should say, that the law of return is one of Israel's first apartheid laws. It is not the only Israeli apartheid law, but it is one of the first. And so this debate or this recent upsurge, let's say, in various organizations writing reports and demonstrating that Israel is an apartheid regime are of course welcome, but long overdue. Because as I said, the law of return was established by Israel in 1950. So we can say without a doubt that Israel has been an apartheid regime since at least 1950. And as I said, the law of return isn't the only apartheid law that Israel established. That is also not the only way that Israel prevents return. Of course, there are direct and indirect ways to prevent return. So for example, during the Nakba in 1948, approximately 500 or so Palestinian villages and towns were depopulated and destroyed. So why were they destroyed? Completely leveled to the ground? This is because, among other things, this is because they wanted to make return even more difficult or set up obstacles to return. So it's another way to indirectly deny return. The confiscation of Palestinian property, of course, or stripping Palestinians of their property rights through the absentee property laws and the present absentee clause is another way in which to complicate or throw obstacles in front of Palestinian return. And then, of course, we have the law of return as well. There are a host of policies, practices, and legislation that Israel has created and continues to practice in order to not only continue to displace Palestinians, but also to deny them return. And what we have done at Badil is produce a series of working papers called Forced Population Transfer, the Case of Palestine. And essentially what we look at is how Israel has denied one or more fundamental rights, created a coercive environment, and continued to perpetuate Palestinian displacement and transfer, as well as their denial of return. And we broke it up into basically 9 main papers. And those are the subtitles of those papers that you see on the screen. So for example, Israel has a permit regime that contains 101 different permits. Permits that are for travel, permits that are for being able to access healthcare, permits for residency, permits for building, development, planning, zoning, et cetera, et cetera. And so they control Palestinians' ability, for example, to access healthcare or education, to be able to reside or live in a certain area, to be able to develop or build in a certain area, and so on and so forth. So if you want to know more, for example, about this permit regime that Israel uses to control various aspects of Palestinian life, then you would go to that paper that is on the installment of a permit regime. Now, due to time constraints, unfortunately, I can't go through the nine policies, which is why I encourage you to use our website if you're interested in a particular policy or a particular way that Israel violates Palestinian rights. But I would like to talk about specifically the denial of return and another Israeli apartheid law. We talked about the indirect ways in which Israel denies return, the demolition of whole villages and communities, the confiscation of the property, which you could read more about, for example, in land confiscation and denial of use, if you want to know more about the absentee property laws and other laws that Israel uses to confiscate land. But I would like to talk about the direct denial of Palestinian return, or how that came about. Shortly after the cessation of armed conflict in 1948, thousands of Palestinians attempted to return. Most of them left with the intention of coming back. They didn't think that they would be exiled forever or for 74 years, or that Israel would continue to deny their return. So most, when they fled in fear and terror due to the massacres and due to the other acts of violence perpetuated by the Zionist militias, they took what they could carry on their backs and their keys, and they went to very nearby areas. Most of them are no more than 10 to 100 kilometers away from their places of origin and habitual residence. So when thousands attempted to return after the ceasefire, this created a very embarrassing situation for the newly created Israel. And also they recognized that the return of Palestinian refugees and internally displaced persons to their places of origin and habitual residence would wipe out all the work that they did in order to manipulate the demographic composition of Palestine. Basically, what they wanted to do, they fabricated a Israeli colonizer population. So they pushed the indigenous inhabitants out, and they replaced them with colonizers from around the world. And in order to maintain this fabricated demographic composition, they had to make sure that Palestinians stayed away. And so they created the Prevention of Infiltration Law. Now, while the Prevention of Infiltration Law came onto the Israeli law books in 1954, it was actually implemented retroactively as soon as Palestinian refugees attempted to return. The Prevention of Infiltration Law basically states that anyone entering Israel illegally will be dealt with in three ways. One, will be deemed an infiltrator. They would label them as an infiltrator, not as a returnee. And they will be dealt with in three ways. One, they will be shot on sight. And thousands of Palestinians attempting to return after the ceasefire were shot on sight. Number two, they would be arrested and detained for 2-year terms that could be renewed at the whim of the state. Thousands more were arrested and detained. Number three, they would be arrested and forced back into exile, and thousands more were arrested and physically transferred out of Palestine. And so the Prevention of Infiltration Law is what put a halt to Palestinian refugees returning of their own accord or without the assistance and the support of the international community. I'd like to talk about, as I said, another Israeli apartheid law, and that is the Israeli nationality law. Now, in most modern nation states, if you're a citizen of the state, you're also a national of the state. And those two terms, citizen and national, are used to mean one and the same thing, or at least that's the case in most domestic state legislation. That's not the case for Israel. There is a vast difference between being a national of Israel and being a citizen of Israel. And the demarcation line, or the difference between being a national and being a citizen, is dependent upon your religious identity. So if you are considered Jewish by Israel, you can achieve, or you are provided with, nationality. However, if you are a non-Jew residing in Israel, then you are only provided with citizenship. And this difference, or this segregation, is based on religious identity. So once again, we have a superior group and we have an inferior group. The superior group, the one that has nationality, has more rights and privileges according to Israeli law, while the inferior group, the non-Jews, who are essentially Palestinians who reside in Israel, are only provided with citizenship, and they have less rights and privileges according to Israeli law. So once again, we have the segregation of people, the establishment of a superior and inferior group. We have the awarding of rights to that superior group, while we have the denial of those basic rights to the inferior group. So once again, we have an apartheid law. So Israel uses apartheid to cement their control over Palestine, to continue to implement policies and practices that will oppress Palestinians, but also to continue to create and maintain that coercive environment so that they can continue to displace Palestinians and replace them with colonizers, as well as keep those Palestinians away. This apartheid regime has Jewish nationals at the very top of the legal hierarchy, with ultimate rights and privileges according to Israeli law. Then we have Palestinians with Israeli citizenship who have significantly less rights and privileges according to Israeli law. After that, we have Palestinians with Jerusalem residency who have even a lower legal status because they are only considered resident aliens according to Israel. Then we have West Bank ID holders, then we have Gaza ID holders, and then we have Palestinian refugees, both here in Palestine and abroad, who essentially have no rights according to Israeli law. So when we talk about Israel, we're not just talking about human rights violations. We are talking about what international law calls international crimes or violations of peremptory norms or grave breaches, which essentially means that Israel is committing the most major faux pas or the most major no-nos according to international law. And this would include, of course, and this is not a comprehensive list, but this would include population transfers, which contain both elements of forcibly displacing and transferring the indigenous Palestinian population, either by physical violent force or the creation of a coercive environment, and replacing them with a settler colonial population, the implantation of a settler colonial population, which essentially is one of the components of colonization, which again is an international crime. And this, of course, includes things like de facto and de jure annexation, which is absolutely prohibited by international law, as well as changing the demographic composition and the denial of self-determination. And then, of course, we can't forget apartheid, which is, again, another international crime according to international law. When we talk about the ongoing Nakba, we also talk about ongoing Palestinian resistance, because according to international law, peoples who are oppressed or facing colonial apartheid regimes also have the right to resist with any means necessary. Any means necessary, according to international law, includes armed and non-armed resistance. And this is a right, according to international law. When we talk about armed resistance, I think we know what we're talking about. We've seen a significant amount of armed resistance in the past couple of weeks. Eric gave us a little bit of a breakdown about what's happening recently in Palestine. And when we talk about non-armed resistance, we are talking about things like popular resistance or civil disobedience. The idea to exist is to resist, which in Arabic is called sumud. Of course, legal advocacy or using different legal tracks, like, for example, the UN, the ICC, the ICJ, as a form of resistance. And then, of course, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, or BDS. Boycott, divestment, and sanctions is considered a legitimate form of non-armed resistance. And the reason I like to emphasize this is because Israel has taken all Palestinian resistance and relabeled it as terrorism. And they are using the anti-terrorism rhetoric to suppress Palestinian resistance even more. So even things like boycott, divestment, and sanctions, which, as I said, is considered a legitimate form of non-armed resistance, Israel has criminalized and equated boycott, divestment, and sanctions with terrorism. And so this is something that we need to be aware of, I think, as civil society, both Palestinian and the international community. I'll stop there and perhaps start taking questions. Eric?
May I start by one question?
Oh, yes, of course. I heard someone talking and it wasn't clear, so
I wonder if Eric was talking. I will pause for a moment to see. Well, let me ask my question just in case.
Yes,
Eric is coming.
please.
Thank you so much for your talk, for spending so much time to simplify some of the most difficult issues in current day situation between Israel and Palestine. My class, the students who are here, is on Islam. Would you be willing to say something about how does this relate to Islam as a religion? We understand, of course, and we started our course by looking at Edward Said's Orientalism. We know that Edward Said was also a Palestinian for whom the issue of Palestine was very important. So how does this play out in a way for understanding of Islam?
I'd like to, I don't know that I can offer much insight to that, but I will say that Israel has portrayed the conflict, and I don't like to use that word because conflict implies an unagreed upon situation between two equal powers or two equal opposing forces, and I don't think that that's the case here. There's a significant imbalance of power. But Israel likes to portray the conflict as something that is religious in nature. And that's not really the case. That's not really the case. It's not the Muslim faith against the Jewish faith. And it's not the Muslim faith against the Christian faith. And it's not the Christian faith against the Jewish faith. It is not a religious conflict. It is an imperial colonial movement that wanted to take control or colonize or oppress a region in the Arab region or an area in the Arab region so that they can have authority and power. And so what they did essentially is that they hijacked Judaism and used it as a justification for the ethnic cleansing of Palestine and the creation of this so-called Jewish state in the same location. If we look at, for example, who Israel considers to be Jewish, half of its population is religiously Jewish and half of its population is secular. So within Israeli law, there is actually a very loose and fast identification of who is Jewish. And it's very vague because they want to be able to bring in the desired population, but not necessarily those Jews that are, for example, Jews of color or Jews of gender diversity or Jews who are of little means or little education, for example. And I can give more examples along that regard. But the bottom line is that this is not a religious conflict. This is a colonial, imperial, secular imposition of the Zionist movement to create this facade of a religious conflict in order to gain sympathy and gain approval from the international community. And it's worked beautifully, to be quite honest, because they have been able to exploit things, very horrific things like the Holocaust, and use, play on people's feelings and people's guilt and so on and so forth, which, should be there because the Holocaust was horrific, but they are using it to further this, this colonial imperial project in Palestine, and not necessarily use it and not necessarily battling the foundations of anti-Semitism and racism, because essentially the Zionist movement itself is based on a racist ideology. So I don't know if that helps or if that answers the, the question.
It puts things in perspective for, I hope, for my students who came from that class with what you said. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and of course they play on Islamophobia. They create this fear of those of the Islamic faith in order to further this conflict. and they pit Palestinians who are Christian against Palestinians who are Muslim, and they create or flare up the racism and the discrimination or the fear of the other, so that of course we are, you know, further fragmented, further isolated, further rejected, further marginalized, and not seen as individuals or as human beings or a national people with inalienable rights.
Exactly. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? I do see something in, oh, thank you. You're welcome, Sylvia.
I think she had to leave, but she thanked before leaving.
Yeah. Oh, see, that was Eric. For me, you're not coming in very clearly. Is anyone else hearing him clearly?
Is that
Yeah.
any better?
That's better.
Oh, yeah, that's better. Yes.
There we go. I had to switch microphones. I wasn't sure. But yeah, thank you for the question, Dr. Davari, and for the great presentation, Lubna. If we have any other questions, feel free to ask it yourself, or you could send it in the chat. Lubna, let me ask you, you had, at the beginning of the presentation, you had mentioned about the mechanisms within the UN and trying to enforce the resolutions and kind of the problems with enforcing it. Could you talk a little bit about that more?
Badil has what is called special consultative status with the UN. We've had it since 2006. As I said, we're a human rights organization, so we do have various initiatives or interventions that we use in order to not change, but in order to get the international community, and when I say international community, I'm talking about the UN, the EU, different member states, third-party states, because they have obligations and responsibilities according to international law. So we use various tracks within the UN mechanisms, and I also mentioned the ICC, the International Criminal Court, and the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, as avenues for advocacy, very specifically legal advocacy based on research, based on analysis of international legal frameworks. So we do things like submit statements to the UN during its regular sessions. There is one of the agenda items within the UN is the occupied territory of Palestine, or the human rights violations that occur in the occupied territory of Palestine. And so we submit through that mechanism statements, but we can also submit to other types of UN mechanisms like the treaty bodies. So we recently submitted to what is called the UPR, the Universal Periodic Review of States. And this is like a periodical review that is done by the UN, by the UPR committee, that looks at the human rights track record of the member states of the UN. And Israel, of course, is a member state of the UN, even though they boycott the UN and basically ignore it most of the time. And so they had their Universal Periodic Review come up this year. Usually it's in 4-year terms, it's a 4-year rollout because they can't do every state every year. So by the time, so each state's turn comes up every 4 years, or, you know, I don't know if I made that clear, but anyways. So we submitted a report, for example, on Israel's continued denial of Palestinian right to self-determination and various other issues. We also participate in the special procedures, or what another mechanism within the UN that is called the special procedures. I don't know if you're aware, but there are specific mandate holders within special procedures, like special rapporteurs. And special rapporteurs can be either thematically mandated, meaning they cover a certain topic. Like, for example, there is a special rapporteur on freedom of speech and expression. But there is also a special rapporteur on the occupied territory. So we can submit reports, we can submit statements, we can work with those individuals who are assigned those specific mandates to advocate with the UN for more practical measures to hold Israel accountable. With the ICJ, there was the recent report, well, it wasn't recent because it was 2004. There was a report done by the ICJ on the wall that Israel constructed or began the construction of in 2002. And so we're in ongoing discussions or meetings, not too regularly because the ICJ is kind of swamped with different things. And so on and so forth. And then, of course, the ICC, the International Criminal Court. We have submitted to the ICC a report on forced population transfer, as well as the violation of, as well as the on persecution, on Israel's persecution of the Palestinian people. So we use these various mechanisms. They are not the greatest because even though international law is very strong with regards to the Palestinian issue, it's only as good as those who are enforcing it. And so the problem is not the legal frameworks themselves. They are very much on the side, let's say, or very much favor the Palestinian issue, but the flaw lies within their biased implementation. And so this is what we're seeing, the biased implementation of international law by these various powers, the UN, the EU, its member states, and so on and so forth. Is that helpful, or?
Yes.
Did you have any follow-up questions?
Not on that specifically. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I do know that the UN Special Rapporteur for the occupied Palestinian territories was recently given that position back in March, and actually within the past couple weeks, she had published her first report. So I'm going to put that in the chat. Actually, the press memo was released today, and then from there you could view the report yourself.
Yeah, I will say that Francesca Albanese, who is the current special rapporteur, is a friend of Badil, and we worked with her on that report, or we made a submission to her to help support her report. And Badil has a long history of working with various special rapporteurs, particularly on the occupied territory, but also, for example, we submitted to the special rapporteur on freedom of speech and expression. We've submitted to the special rapporteur on freedom of assembly and association. We've submitted to the special rapporteur on adequate housing. So it depends on the rapporteur themselves, what kind of report they want to issue, and if we are able to contribute in any meaningful way, then we send submissions and we send support to them to be able to fulfill their mandate. I will say that the special rapporteurs are volunteers. They don't get paid anything by the UN to do the work that they do. So it's very much appreciated that there are individuals out there who are willing to do this very hard work and perhaps come under fire for it. I do know Francesca, even though she has just started her work as special rapporteur, she has, as I said, has been a friend of Badil, or has worked with Badil quite frequently in the past, and continues to do so. And so she actually has already come under fire for some of the work that she has done and for some of the statements that she has issued. So it's much appreciated. There are people who are willing to do that.
Thank you so much. Do we have any other questions? Okay, it looks like we are all good. Thank you once again for a wonderful presentation, Lubna, for your time and energy in all of this. I am going to plug Badil and some other links in the chat now. You can find Badil at badil.org or their Instagram and Twitter at badil_center. And then I also am putting some links. The first one is a feedback form for this event. The next one is an educational resource Google Drive called Learning Palestine that I have created to help people further the education outside of the events that we host. And then the last one is the Instagram account for the student organization that will be launching very soon within the next 1 to 2 weeks, hopefully. And we will be hosting more of these events on USD campus and within the community of San Diego. So we hope that you guys can follow us on Instagram and stay updated on all the events that we're doing. Thank you all for joining us today. And again, thank you once again, Lubna, for your time
Thank
and
you.
effort.
Thank you so much, Eric. Thank you, Lubna.
Thank you, my pleasure. Good luck.
Thank you, Lubna.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Have a great day, everyone.
You too.